Chapter 21 of Victories, Part 2. The water was getting shallower. Twilight hadn't noticed it at first, so engrossed in the process of testing and note-taking as she investigated her powers of compulsion over her new pet spider. She had been brought out of her study haze once, briefly, when Midnight noted the presence of a solitary railroad curving through the mountains, but only long enough to let her other half guide their body along the track before sinking back into her work. She'd learned much, and after hours of relaxing experimentation and iterating a few drafts of her written findings, Twilight had finally pulled her attention back to the world around her to find that she could see the surface.
Ah, welcome back,
Midnight quipped.
That's been there for almost an hour now, you know. How long has...
Twilight blinked.
Oh. Yes, I was wondering how long you'd go before finally looking up. Or perhaps noticing all of the light around us.
Twilight was too focused on taking in their surroundings to bother with acknowledging the jab. And after so long with Midnight's constant prodding in her ears, she would have barely registered it anyway. The rails they were following hugged the mountains here, with a wall of jagged stone to her left and a sheer cliff on her right. Actual sunlight filtered down from the ocean surface, lending some color to the craggy terrain around her, and a small gasp escaped her as she spotted vibrant mounds of coral clinging to the stones. Small fish fled into hidey holes as she passed, poking their heads out in her wake, while larger ones swam the valley to her side in sparse, scattered groups. There were no bones or ruins here.
Where could this railroad possibly lead?
She wondered.
We're so far north, beyond the farthest equestrian border, and these mountains are so high. Who would have built rails on this kind of terrain with no destination? Not a pony smart enough to survive the task. There must be something here. Most likely it's the very same thing that the weak princess came searching for. She has a name, you know.
Twilight shot Midnight a reproachful glance.
I would appreciate it if you used it. Why? She is a corpse, and without any accomplishments to speak of. She doesn't deserve a name.
Twilight pursed her lips, but didn't rise to the bait.
Cadence isn't dead, and she's a good friend.
Midnight didn't respond, but her skepticism was apparent across their mental connection. Twilight sighed. They walked in silence for a time, observing their surroundings as they followed the rails ever higher up the mountain.
I noticed something when you were doing your tests.
Twilight arched a brow, turning towards the spot in the side of her vision where Midnight seemed to be lying on some invisible, floating platform.
Yes?
The apparition seemed strangely hesitant, looking down before speaking, as if to consider her words.
When you order Skilla, she responds.
Twilight cocked her head.
Well, yes, I noticed that too. I'm hoping there might be some pattern to the responses, but it's impossible to tell with such a small sample size.
Midnight narrowed her eyes.
She responds to us the same way we speak to her. In our minds. Through our darkness.
Twilight quirked her lips.
Were you paying attention when I was taking notes? I already got all of this. Think, little flower!
Midnight stomped a hoof, and Twilight could hear a dull thud, even though there was nothing but empty water underneath it.
We are able to command her with spoken orders through our darkness, and she can speak back. Remember when we fought Spike, and his own darkness made an assault on our minds?
Twilight blinked. After a few seconds, her eyes widened.
You don't think... He was trying to dominate us, as we dominated those spiders.
Midnight stood, stalking through the water to Twilight's side.
This power is not unique to us. Any of our kind are capable or vulnerable to the same. But that would mean all this time.
Twilight looked into Midnight's bloodshot eyes, seeing her own realization reflected back at her.
All these monsters we faced, even the sea ponies. We've been at risk of losing ourselves to them.
Midnight nodded with a self-satisfied smirk.
Now you see.
A shiver passed down Twilight's spine. She looked back to where Skilla was following dutifully behind them and let out a thoughtful hum.
Fascinating. What? No!
Twilight blinked, and Midnight was hovering in front of her with a frustrated scowl.
Dangerous! We should kill the spider before it attempts to manipulate us. What? But we just got her! And I still have so many tests I can do!
Twilight paused before coming up with a third, more appropriate argument.
And she hasn't done anything wrong. Is it your pet now, little flower? You realize it only listens to your lab reports because you tell it to, yes? You're being ridiculous.
Twilight rolled her eyes as she stepped through her dark reflection.
No matter how we feel about her, she's useful, and she's not a threat. She can scout ahead in dangerous places, hunt for us while we... Fine!
Midnight's cold weight settled on Twilight's back, and she leaned in close to breathe her next words into her ear.
But if the thing dares to betray us, I shall ensure it lives just long enough to regret its actions. She's a she.
Twilight snapped. Midnight only laughed in turn. Then they crested the rise ahead of them, and Twilight drew up short. The craggy ascent that Twilight had taken for a mountain came to a stop in a sudden plateau that stretched out before her far into the distance. And in the center of that plateau, shimmering with colorful patterns of captured sunlight, was a magnificent tower of smooth blue crystal. The railroad tracks came to a stop only a few dozen meters away from the ridge, perhaps at the site of a long decimated train station, but Twilight paid them little mind. Without hesitation, she pulled Skilla in close and channeled her magic, flinging herself across the seafloor with a crackle and a flash. She came out of the teleport in a wide avenue paved with diamond, flanked on either side with angular buildings carved from translucent emerald, ruby, and sapphire, all twinkling with the sunlight filtered through the ice above. Rough-hewn equine statues dotted the street, each one posed as if rearing up or galloping. They were far less polished than the rest of the city, and colored a menacing purple. Long, sharp trails of crystal jutted out to their sides, looking almost as if some painter had called them into being with pained, hurried strokes.
What is this place?
Twilight gaped up at the towering palace in the center of the city, taking in the way it channeled the sunlight like a beacon, before reflecting it out over the city almost like some ethereal rainbow shield.
An entire city of crystal? This must be what we are looking for.
Midnight walked a slow circle around one of the nearest statues, before jerking her head towards the palace.
I can sense a powerful darkness in there. Like the Beast Queen of Canterlot, but far worse.
Twilight nodded.
We'll have to be careful.
She approached the statue next to Midnight, inspecting its craftsmanship. A chill crept down her spine.
These aren't statues.
Midnight let out a thoughtful hum.
This is a powerful magic.
Now that she was close, Twilight could just make out the very real flesh and blood pony encased within the jagged shell of shadowy crystal. It was difficult to pick out the precise lines of the face, but the wide, terrified eyes of the mare frozen before her caught the light with an eerie glimmer.
Are all of these?
Twilight went from statue to statue, a deepening pit of dread forming in her gut as she found a pony in each one. Some looked as if they had been running for their lives, while others wore the grim visages of soldiers, the shapes of their helmets and spears still recognizable as they stood petrified in some ancient battle.
Sweet Celestia. We should keep moving,
Midnight said, starting towards the palace.
The thing that did this may still linger. Right.
With a gulp, Twilight turned to follow Midnight's lead. Midnight glanced back to the crystal spider chittering along at Twilight's side.
Skilla, lead us forth.
The spider chirped her assent before speeding her pace, Twilight's magic moving unbidden to split their shield into two. Twilight shot Midnight a sideways look, but said nothing. As they traveled deeper into the city, the petrified crystal ponies became more common, and then were joined by giant, jagged spearheads of black crystal that stabbed up out of the ground. The dark protrusions didn't reflect any light at all, and where they disturbed the smooth diamond of the street or pierced damaged buildings alongside, even the crystal around them seemed to lose some of its luster. Twilight began to cast anxious looks over her shoulder, wary of some monster waiting in ambush. But even the pings she sent out returned only more crystal, or bodies trapped inside of it. The city was large, but the path Skilla was leading them down traced a straight line to the palace in the center, and it didn't take long for them to reach it. 4 massive vaulted legs formed a square base, with wide, towering arches on each side, giving pedestrians free rein to walk under its shadow. In the very center, above where intricate patterns of multicolored crystal had been worked into the shape of a snowflake, 2 thin, tapering columns of crystal waited. They reminded Twilight of a stalactite and stalagmite, with a perhaps pony-sized gap between their pointed tips. It almost felt like there should be something between them, but the space was empty. Skilla turned, sensing that she had fulfilled her given objective, and returned to Twilight's side.
Where do we go from here? We will most likely find what we seek in this tower,
Midnight suggested, looking up at the conspicuous gap.
but we should prepare thoroughly before we brave it.
Twilight arched a brow at her doppelganger's back.
What? No bluster about us being unstoppable together?
Midnight's tail flicked behind her as she let out a low growl.
There is a difference between fearlessness and arrogance, little flower. If you wish to chide me for not charging into uncertain peril, then you are free to lead us into it in my stead.
Twilight pursed her lips.
Sorry, it's just unlike you.
Shaking her head, Twilight trotted to the opposite side of the tower and cast her gaze across the city. More ruins, more crystal corpses. Had even this distant, unknown corner of her world been left dead and cold by whatever fate befell Equestria? A fuzzy shadow passed over her, and Twilight looked up. She squinted in confusion as she picked out a smooth, rounded silhouette floating lazily above the ice.
Is that an airship?
As it turned out, taming the barons was something easier said than done. The negotiations were taking place in a well-stocked tavern near the edge of the city, miraculously untouched by the fighting, despite the burned-out and collapsed ruins of its neighbors. A squad of bluecoats waited outside in a disciplined line, their rigid posture and stern faces belying the exhaustion evident in their dirtied uniforms. Baronlanders marched through the street before them, jeering and laughing and displaying the spoils they'd already looted from the city. But if the Frieslanders took any offense from the mocking, they did a fine job hiding it. Rarity was far less skilled in such matters. She was seated on a blanketed pile of loose cobbles across the street, pointedly ignoring the soft smudges of rock dust on her white dress. She scowled at the foolish behavior on display before lifting her mug to her lips and taking an unladylike draw of cider. It wasn't her first choice. She would have preferred something smoother, perhaps a relaxing glass of wine or a daiquiri, but finding cider was infinitely easier amidst the chaos of a reorganizing army. After spending several hours locked in a room with Governor Rhea and a trio of barons all bickering over who got what, she really needed a drink. "Are you well, my lady?" Pontius stood beside her, surveying the street as if he was on guard duty. "You appear unwell."
Just tired, darling. And you know you could just call me a rarity, if you wish.
She narrowed her eyes at the tavern's door.
I think I've had quite enough of titles for some time now.
Oh, Pontius cleared his throat. "If it pleases you, Rarity." She gave him a warm smile, and he looked away with a soft blush.
Well, if we dally out here for too much longer, then we risk the peace being struck without us. Shall we?
She took one last drink before setting her cider aside and rising to her hooves. Pontius walked by her side as she crossed the street. "To be frank, my Rarity, only Celestia's intervention could get the ponies in that room to come to an agreement without our aid."
True, but I wouldn't be surprised if the barons got it in their heads to simply overpower Rhea and force her huff. Brutes.
Rarity shot Pontius a sideways smirk, just as the sound of Pinky's wheels clattering over the potholed stone caught her ear.
Oh, is Pinky back? Rarity!
Pinky's shrill, sing-song voice gave just enough forewarning for a few idle soldiers to leap out of the way before she skidded around a corner, muzzle stretched into a wide smile, and quickly galloped up the street.
I found Fluttershy!
On cue, Fluttershy stepped into view, much of her body and her wings hidden behind a long cloak and a young brown bear bounding along at her side. She kept her hooded head down, long mane brushing the street as she hurried to catch up. The Baronland troops all along the street shifted from boisterous merrymaking to quiet, polite conversation as she passed them, and some even stepped away from their peers to greet the blushing Pegasus with gentle greetings or waves. Pinky drew up as if to stop, but too late. She giggled as Pontius, now somewhat familiar with her antics, braced himself and arrested her rapid approach with a quiet grunt. Rarity was more focused on Fluttershy, however. She welcomed the Pegasus with a warm smile as she walked up.
Fluttershy, darling! I do hope the siege camp wasn't too rough on you in our absence. Oh no, thank you, Rarity.
Fluttershy answered with a demure smile.
Brownie kept me company, and the soldiers are all very nice. So I see,
Rarity said, scanning the street. Although the soldiers had loudened some after Fluttershy passed, their behavior was still far from the rambunctious rowdiness it was before. She looked back to Fluttershy with a teasing smirk.
Perhaps you could explain how it is that your presence gets these troops in line when their own officers seem incapable of it. They know I don't like it being very loud is all.
Fluttershy sat down, smiling as Brownie nuzzled himself between her forelegs. She waved to Pontius as he freed himself from Pinky's hug.
Hello, Pontius.
Lady Fluttershy. Pontius dipped his head. It's good to see you've earned the respect of the troops so quickly.
Indeed it is,
Rarity agreed.
though I admit I'm somewhat surprised. No offense, dear, but truthfully, I'd been rather concerned about them bullying you while you were on your own.
The corner of Fluttershy's smile twisted into a small grin.
And we all thought you'd be helpless when those diamond dogs dragged you into their dens. But you're stronger than that.
She hugged Brownie against her as she looked away.
I guess, I can be strong too. No offense.
Rarity blinked. For a moment, she was so shocked at hearing that kind of ribbing in Fluttershy's bashful voice that she wondered if she'd imagined it.
My, she has changed so much. But then, perhaps all of us have.
Rarity shook herself.
Well, darling, as much as I'd love to trade stories of our times apart, I'm afraid Pontius and I really must be getting back to the meeting.
Fluttershy looked to Pinky.
Is Pinky not going? Nope.
Pinky blew a loud raspberry.
Those stuffy, stiffened stuffs in there think I wouldn't have anything meaningful to contribute. Me. Ha!
Rarity exchanged an amused glance with Fluttershy.
Either way, I quite look forward to catching up later. Ta for now, girls.
With one last wave, Rarity and Pontius turned for the tavern door. He stepped forward to hold it open, and she thanked him with a graceful nod before crossing inside. With the curtains drawn shut, the door closed, and the one table remaining on the floor illuminated only by candlelight and a quietly crackling fire in the hearth, the inside of the tavern might have inspired a certain sense of dread, or perhaps mystery. And indeed, on first arrival, Rarity had almost expected the negotiations to take place during some kind of masquerade ball. But then the talking had started, and all sense of atmosphere had been promptly murdered by an endless tirade of bitter argument. That was perhaps 6 hours ago, and it was still going. You're daft in the head if you think I'm gonna let you have all that to yourself! Count Dane slammed a hoof against the table as he yelled. His beard was notably shorter than when Rarity saw him before the siege. The scruffy hairs charred and blackened at the tips, and he now wore a set of chainmail under his shoulder cape. 'Twas my hussars that led the charge into the city, and you know your musketeers would have been helpless without 'em. Count Armet, the only Baronlander at the table not wearing armor, merely arched a brow. He remained seated, but the edge in his voice was clearly audible. Aye, your hussars were vital to the battle, as were my musketeers, as was every soldier in the fight, but I'd hardly say they were irreplaceable. He raised a hoof to cut off Dane's heated response. If you were to speak of those truly vital, you'd speak of my cannoneers and sappers. We'd never even reach the walls otherwise. Countess Silky, her mussed-up mane no doubt the fault of a helmet resting on the table beside her, let out a loud snort. It's good to speaking of vital, then. I'll gladly accept the glory for victory, considering both your armies have grown fat on rations from my villages. Pah! Count Dane waved away with a hoof. We're paying you for the supplies. I'll accept that argument when the first bits finally show up. Silky smirked. Until then, you two remain indebted to me. Governor Rhea, who had sat quietly smoldering as the three nobles argued around her, drew attention with a forceful clear of her throat. Perhaps it would be easier for you to decide how to split the glory once we've actually reached a peace agreement. Rarity let out a quiet sigh. Here we go again. All three barons were offended by the suggestion, but Count Dane was the loudest. You know exactly what we're getting out of the peace. Your city belongs to us now, Frieslander.
If that's what you believe,
Rhea growled,
then perhaps I should lock myself back within its inner walls and let you bleed for it.
The counts faltered, exchanging glances with each other. Everyone in the room wanted to avoid the bloody battle that would be required in order to truly earn an unconditional surrender. Count Dane sat back down with a bitter grumble. Rarity looked to Pontius, leaning over to whisper.
If we don't find some way to resolve this, then they will fall back on bloodshed, and all our struggle will have been for naught.
Pontius nodded gravely.
We must somehow satisfy the barons without destroying the city.
He pursed his lips, glancing back towards the door.
If only my father was here. The others hold much respect for him. He could stop their petty bickering.
Couldn't you speak for him?
Rarity asked.
As his heir, you must hold some sway.
Pontius grimaced.
I might, but they don't respect me as you do. They see me as a child. Nothing I say would be taken as my father's word.
But we know you're no child, don't we?
Rarity gave him an encouraging smile.
I suspect your father would love nothing more than for you to step out of his shadow and become your own stallion. And after what we've been through in the city, I have faith that you're ready for that.
Pontius blanched.
But, Rarity, what I do doesn't matter. It's how they see me.
Rarity stifled a giggle into her hoof. When she looked up, the young Pegasus was looking down with a fierce blush, and she pulled him into a reassuring hug, bringing her muzzle to his ear.
What you do is far, far more important than how ponies see you, darling. And you should never let the latter influence the former.
She gave him a quick peck on the cheek before pulling back to look him in the eye.
Now, follow my lead.
She didn't wait for him to respond before turning away and approaching the table. If he had any lingering doubts in his mind, she expected his chivalry would spur him into motion once she'd put herself under the spotlight. She greeted the table with her most polite smile.
I do hope I haven't missed too much in my brief absence. Have we made any progress? We've lost progress,
Governor Reyes said, glaring at the barons.
As usual, it seems Baron Greed can't even wait for a peace to be struck before they begin squabbling over who gets which slice of the corpse.
Count Armid scoffed.
These are important parts of the negotiation. How can any of us agree to peace when we cannot be assured that we'll be properly compensated for our losses?
Compensated?
Rhea echoed acridly.
You besieged my city. It's far from our obligation to compensate you for your trouble. Darlings, please.
Rarity lifted a hoof, cutting off what she could tell was yet another pointless circular argument.
You came here for Nettlekiss, did you not? I'm sure the governor is more than willing to withdraw her protection.
She shot a pointed look at Rhea.
Right?
Her lips tightened, but she nodded.
I am. My cousin is not worth my city. And we would have been happy to leave you to your walls if you'd done as much when we arrived,
Countess Silky said, pointing a hoof tip at the city mare.
But you challenged us, and you forced us to spend blood for your compliance. So now reparation must be made. 'Tis not an unreasonable claim. I suppose we're all ignoring the fact that the Frieselanders lost lives too, then.
Rarity shot Rhea a sympathetic glance, but didn't voice the thought. It would only make the peace between the two sides even more tenuous than it already was.
I can understand your want for reparations,
Rarity said, trying to hide her disdain at the idea of the aggressors being paid for their actions.
But surely there's no need to butcher the city for it.
Butcher it?
day. Count Dane shook his head. But the only way to ensure we're paid what we deserve is to take the city for ourselves. You'd have to be mad to trust a Frieslander to pay you a fair earning.
Well, what if there wasn't a Frieslander in charge?
Verity suggested. She walked around the table as she spoke, subtly giving Pontius a pointed look while all eyes were on her.
A Baronlander could supervise the city, ensuring you receive your compensation.
She looked to Rhea.
Without bleeding it dry.
Armet let out a thoughtful hum. But with whom could we entrust the task? Any one of us or our vassals would be sure to favor one party unfairly. I shall do it. All eyes turned to Pontius. He stood firm, meeting the skeptical and suspicious gazes leveled on him. Verity gave him a reassuring smile when he looked to her.
Young Pontius?
Countess Silky asked curiously.
What do you know of running a province?
And how could we trust you to pay us fairly? Count Dane added, his suspicion clear in his voice. Have I ever been known to lie to you? Pontius asked, meeting the older stallion's stare. You all know me to be an honest pony, and I give you my word to lead the city justly. I'm not some puppet for my father, but even though he's not here, I can speak for him on this matter. Count Dane leaned back with a grunt, and Pontius turned to the other nobles. Duke Titus has no wish to destroy the city, or to loot it, but to ensure the benefits of its resources can be felt all across the island. It's true that I'm not as experienced as many of you in these matters, but my father's taught me much, and I'm well capable of learning from the city ponies. He glanced to Rhea before continuing. I'm sure the governor would be more than willing to assist in an advisory position. After a brief hesitation, Rhea nodded.
I would.
Silky leaned in, crossing her hooves on the table.
But if we cannot take the city for ourselves, then what does it offer us in return for our losses? Shares.
Rhea answered quickly.
We can grant you shares in our largest guilds. Our wealth will be yours.
Shares? Ahmed echoed, looking around the table in confusion. Silky rolled her eyes.
It means you get the profit, but you don't have to manage it. It's a good deal. It has my support.
Count Dane snorted. What good is guild profits to an honest baron lord? I want land.
You can get your land from my cousin,
Brea countered,
or the fields around the city. But you won't get a single inch within our walls without fighting for it.
Count Armet nodded. Guild shares are quite valuable, Dane. We'll get more in the long run than we ever would from looting the city center. Pah! Fine. Count Dane leaned back with a scowl. But if the city doesn't give what's promised, I'll be holding the two of you accountable. For a moment, the table lapsed into silence. Rarity, who had been watching the exchange with bated breath, finally spoke.
So, we are agreed then?
Silky nodded.
Aye? Unless any of you have last objections?
After waiting to receive nods of assent from everyone at the table, the Countess looked back to the bar, where a single bespectacled unicorn sat in silence.
Whitehorn, draft the treaty, just as we've discussed it. I've had enough of this place for today. Shall we convene here again on the morrow?
Suits me, Armet said, rising to stretch his legs. For now, I bid you all farewell. With a quick bow across the room, Armet made for the door. Silky was close behind, pausing beside Pontius to give him a reassuring pat and smile before following the other noble outside. Dane was the last to leave, his messy beard twitching as he grumbled under his breath with every step. Brea stood as well, looking to Pontius.
You meant what you said? About keeping me on as an advisor?
He nodded.
I'm sure you know much more about the running of the city than I would. Your exile would only cause the city needless harm.
You see, darling?
Rarity offered up a tentative smile.
Surely this piece is better than the alternative.
Rhea pursed her lips.
In that regard, only time will tell.
The governor's shoulders sagged as she made for the door. She paused as she reached it, took a deep breath, and raised her head high before stepping out. Finally, the table was empty. Rarity exchanged a proud glance with Pontius before turning to Whitehorn, who was nursing a clear glass of whiskey he'd poured for himself at the bar.
You can write to the deal, right?
She asked.
Do you think any of them will back out?
He smiled before giving a small shake of his head.
No, my lady. I expect all that remains is the formalities of signing. Aside from some last damages from the more opportunistic Baron troops, the city is safe.
He raised his glass to her in toast.
Nettlekes will see the wisdom of surrender once her Friesland support pulls out. Thanks to you, the island will be at peace once more.
Goodness.
Rarity let out a shaky breath as her hind legs dropped out from beneath her, and she leaned against Pontius for support.
We came so close to disaster. Perhaps it's silly of me, but somehow I keep expecting some new crisis to arise and throw us into the fire once more.
Whitehorn snorted.
Even if that were to happen, we could face it. We make a good team.
Yes. Yes, I suppose we do.
Rarity glanced up towards Pontius.
We all do.
For a moment, none of them said anything. Pontius rested a hoof over Rarity's, and she didn't pull it away.